And let's continue with Andrew Israel Ross, Loyola University, Maryland.
Oh God. So I'm gonna keep an eye on the door. We see people running. I'm going to begin my remarks by talking a bit about Michael as a mentor and the way in which he really facilitated my own work. So I first met Michael when I was off to do my dissertation research. God, like 11 years ago now, I guess. My advisor in Michigan suggested I email him. I'd read his work, obviously, right? All of the articles that we're going to be talking about. And he very graciously asked me to grab a drink with him in Paris at the Urbana-Campaign, which was one of his favorites. I saw some memorials of him, and a couple of people noted his fondness for this particular gay bar in the Marais. So we had a drink. And I was terrified, absolutely terrified, because I knew he was working on the topic I wanted to work on. I was going to do a queer history, a gay history really, of 19th century Paris, and that was what he had been working on for a lot longer than, quite frankly, I was at the time alive. And so I really was worried I was going to be stepping on some toes. But Michael, was the most generous person when it came to this, right? He gave me the information I needed for the archives. He introduced me to another young scholar who he was also mentoring, Régis Ravenin, who also then gave me information on the archives. He read my manuscripts as I was developing them. And so in many respects, the book that, now, finally sits on the book display really owes itself to that initial meeting. And though, if you read my work and you read his, there are significant differences in our approach that we both recognize, and I'll talk about about more in a bit. But nevertheless, Michael Sibalis is someone who, if I could ever be a mentor like he was, that would be, something quite special. So I really owe him quite a bit, even as we, diverged in what we ultimately wanted to argue. We're to talk about one article. I kind of chose two interrelated articles. I'm going to be relatively brief, but I chose two related to Michael's work in the history of homosexuality, including, to begin with, his contribution to that seminal collection, Homosexuality in Modern France, edited by Jeff Merrick and Tip Reagan, The Regulation of Male Homosexuality in Revolutionary and Napoleonic France, 1789 to 1815. And this article, I think its importance is, unfortunately, I think as with a lot of Michael's work, its importance is underestimated. So in this article, Michael pushed forward our knowledge about how and why homosexuality was regulated during the Revolutionary Napoleonic periods. For those of you who don't know, it's during the Revolution that the anti-sodomy statutes disappear, right? So questions of why and how that happened, and what are its effects on the lives of men seeking sex with other men in particular, what were they? And I'm grateful to see that work continues. I just did a peer review of an article that is continuing to ask questions about that particular topic. And so in that article, Michael begins to map out a new chronology of sexual regulation in France, declaring that, quote, for all of the many ambiguities, this is in his conclusion, for all of the many ambiguities of the period, the Revolutionary and Napoleonic era was a time of relative freedom for pederasts and sodomites, and pederasts, again, is a term that was, for our purposes, can just be equated to male homosexual. If you're interested in more detail, we can talk about that in the Q&A. This was a time of relative freedom for pederasts and sodomites, especially when compared to the years before 1789 and after 1840 or 1850. So following following the work of other French historians such as Pierre Hahn and Michel Rey, Michael here implies that male homosexuals did not have a singular experience of repression, that the story of male homosexuality is not one of simply enduring darkness, or even the opposite, as the lack of an anti-sodomy statute was sometimes assumed to be, that France was better for gay men, for instance, than it may be the United Kingdom. So instead, male same-sex sexual behavior was differently treated depending on a particular social and political moment. And this might not seem like a terribly bold claim now, but at the origin point, I mean, in the middle, I guess, of the development of the history of sexuality, historians of sexuality had to definitively show that that was the case, that sexuality itself is not this enduring natural state, but rather is something that actually has a history. And that's what, in many respects, he was doing in that mid-90s article. And so indeed, despite Michael's own resistance to some of his insights, he was showing that sexuality was, the story of the history of sexuality was not, as Michel Foucault once put it, quote, simply the chronicle of an increasing repression. And we needed him to tell us, or to help show this, in order for us to understand that the history of especially homosexuality was not going to be simple. And it was not simply going to be the story of recovering agency and recovering repression, right? That it was going to be more complicated. So Michael's somewhat counterintuitive interpretation of the lives of men who sought sex with other men was in many respects ahead of its time. He continued to take up this theme in what was, for me at least, his most important article for me, let's put it that way. The title of the article, The Palais Royal and the Homosexual Subculture of the 19th Century, published in a volume he co-edited with Jeff Merrick, Homosexuality in French History and Culture, and this came out in 2001. So Michael's argument here was relatively straightforward, but I would argue that it's precisely why it's so important for historians of sexuality, and in particular, historians of Paris, to try to understand. And I think historians of Paris would do well to pay greater attention to Michael's argument. Put simply, and this is an argument that focuses on the Palais Royal in the 19th century in particular. So Michael argues here that male homosexuals were not cordoned off in some hidden part of the city, but rather were quite public, seeking sexual partners in one of the most frequented areas of the capital. As he put it in opening the chapter, quote, "Perhaps the most startling feature of Paris's homosexual subculture in this earlier period is not how invisible it was, but on the contrary, how conspicuous it could be, at least at certain times and in certain places. Just as he had already shown how legal arrangements could not be reduced to repression, he here showcased the ways in which homosexuality was not hidden, but rather had moments of greater or lesser publicity." So using the Palais Royal as his example, Michael traced how men who sought sex with other men appropriated the city for their own ends, not in secret, but in full view. This publicity, Michael argued, had very real effects, as the stylistic and behavioral accoutrements of queer cruising were taken up and described in a variety of police, medical, and other published texts. So it's not expert discourse that's like describing and creating homosexual identity, it's gay men themselves who are giving expert discourse the information that then they then report out. And historians of the US, George Chauncey, made similar claims for New York. So the common image of the effeminate hustler on the streets of Paris moved from the behaviors of the Palais Royal to expert commentary that ostensibly sought to define it. Here, most famously, Ambroise Tardieu's forensic pathology describing the dress of men seeking sex with other men, for instance. So the descriptions of men who sought sex with other men, important in medical commentary, had their origins in the way queer men actually used urban space. In this respect, Michael's analysis of gay Paris tells us a great deal about the ways that expert discourse reflected the ways the city was actually used. Michael showed, in other words, that to speak of the construction of homosexual identity and community, one must speak of a dialogue between those who encountered and those who observed sexual solicitation between men, that it is people on the street engaged with people who are writing about them and back and forth. So for me, this was key. And although Michael used the term subculture, he implicitly shows that subculture was not actually the way to understand what was happening in the 19th century. As he concludes, quote, "Tens of thousands of Parisians must have observed for themselves at least some of the conspicuously public homosexual activity that took place there. And therefore, I would say, participated in that activity, right? Participation itself, witnessing is a form of participation. What you do after that is up to you. And according to my research, I'm not sure they all just walked away. So So for me, for my own research, this insight was key. And I took it in a different direction than Michael did or would have preferred, questioning, for instance, the use of the term homosexual, the use of the term subculture. But fundamentally, it was this insight that will always bind our work together. So even as I try to show in my book that to speak of, quote, homosexual activity or even men misses the more nebulous identities and behaviors that I would argue were at play in 19th century Paris, putting into question, in some sense, both of our participation in, quote unquote, gay history. I'm not sure there is a gay history of 19th century Paris. I remain absolutely convinced of the importance of Michael's key insight from almost 20 years ago, that homosexuality, or as I prefer, male same-sex sexual behavior, was present in full knowledge in the middle of Paris, that it was central, not incidental to the city, and the way it was experienced by both men who sought sex with other men and those who did not. We cannot do, therefore, a history of Paris without a history of these men. So if I allude to some of my disagreements with Michael, it's because I would argue he relished them. He wants to, and I laugh now, I did not laugh at the time, he once declared by email that I treated him as a, quote, straw man in an article. I disagree with that characterization. He never stopped engaging with the way we read our sources differently. He was not that kind of mentor. He was someone who pushed you forward. He did not try to hold you back. He wrote me about that article with which he so viscerously disagreed, and we promised we would talk about it next time we were in Paris. Sorry, we didn't get to do that. He was going to do it in an edited volume that I'm co-editing with Nina Kushner, where he was going to talk about some of these disagreements about the rise of gay identity, both in rural and urban spaces. And I'm looking forward to seeing some of that work, as I know some of his friends and colleagues are gathering it at the moment. As I hope I've shown here, ultimately, these disagreements were never as important as his work. Thank you.